Thank you very much. Thank you, firstly, Joe, for the kind invitation to come back to MacGill. I'm really delighted to be here. It's an honour to be asked. You've had a fantastic lineup all week, and I'm sure you're enjoying it as much as everybody that I've met since I arrived. There's not a whole lot left for me to say. In many ways, we've had 3 outstanding contributions, all stimulating, all complementary, and I don't think I could really disagree with any of it. But let me begin. I think it's abundantly clear the Eurozone crisis is complex, but that shouldn't come as a surprise. The European Union and, of course, the Eurozone itself are among the most complex political and economic frameworks in the world. If you go to the United States, for example, and try to explain the European Union to American politicians or indeed American citizens, they really don't have much of a grasp of what it's all about. And I think it's partly because the European Union involves a really difficult balance between 27 sovereign member states, 17 in the case of the Eurozone, as they work together to try to take crucial decisions every day, decisions which impact on the lives of all of the citizens in the 27 member states and also impact on the rest of the world. Why is it so complicated? Well, we have a lot of conspiracy theorists out there, and many of them, I think, might suggest that it's deliberately complex, that it's some sort of a dangerous Machiavellian type of plan to strip countries of their sovereignty, to vest in so-called faceless bureaucrats undemocratic powers to set our tax rates, or to, in the more dramatic examples, to send us off to war. They might claim that certain countries want to dominate others, or even worse, that some countries are intent on taking over the European Union completely. Needless to say, I don't share these views. The EU is complex and laborious, in my opinion, by necessity, bringing 27 member states together to take common decisions on key issues such as economic policy or energy policy or foreign relations is not easy. 27 sovereign states with 27 governments and 27 parliaments to whom they're accountable each have 27 distinct sets of national priorities, even though we have shared values and many shared aspirations. We still have a national interest at the end of the day, each and every one of us. So negotiation and decision making are arduous. It's painstaking, and it's often an awful lot slower than we might like. I don't think it's due to any grand conspiracy on the part of the so-called elite, but rather I think it's a reflection of the immense task of trying to broker agreement among so many countries. So a legitimate question then is, well, is it all worthwhile? And would we be better off if we were released from the shackles of the EU decision-making process with more flexibility and more autonomy and a lot less compromise with others? The answer to that, of course, is an unequivocal no. I think there are 2 simple but very compelling reasons for Ireland and for the other European countries to continue sharing sovereignty, to continue making sacrifices in exchange for common gain. One is historical, and in many ways it's a little bit cliched, but I think it's worth reiterating. The other relates to the present and to the future, and is of absolutely vital importance to all countries in the European Union. So on the first point, it's always worth recalling the genesis of the European project. Too many people take for granted the stability and the peace that we enjoy in Europe. In my opinion, it's far too convenient to forget about the bloodshed and the slaughter that characterised the first part of the 20th century. We've worked hard to build peaceful cooperation in Europe, and it has always involved sacrifice and difficult decisions. Sometimes we like to think of the idea of compromise as being something new, something that has only evolved in Europe or in the European project in the last few years or the last decade or so. It's not. It was from compromise that the European cooperation was born, and the massacre and the economic obliteration of the First World War and the Second World War was left behind because of it. And I think it's worth remembering the words of Winston Churchill, speaking in Zurich in 1946 in the aftermath of the Second World War, where he described the tragedy of a broken continent. Over wide areas, a vast, quivering mass of tormented, hungry, careworn and bewildered human beings gape at the ruins of their cities and homes and scan the dark horizons for the approach of some new peril, tyranny or terror. Compromise is tough, but it bears fruit. If those who today advocate pig-headedness, divisiveness and isolation had had their way in 1951, there would be no peace in Europe. We would not have enjoyed the economic growth and prosperity that has characterised the EU for the past 60 years. We would not be able to live and work and study all over the Union. We would not have benefited from structural funds, from the Common Agricultural Policy, cohesion funds, and so on and so forth. The politics of no achieves nothing. The politics of engagement shapes the world and makes the unimaginable become reality. Besides the historical successes for Ireland and for all of Europe in pursuing a path of deeper integration, there are obvious but often underrated reasons to continue on this path of integration and cooperation. In the increasingly globalised world, we need each other. We Europeans take our position of dominance for granted. The United States and Europe have ruled the roost for as long as any of us can remember. We've enjoyed the sort of economic might that set the global agenda. And it may not always feel like it, but we have enjoyed wealth and prosperity that could only have been dreamed of in countries like India, Brazil and China. Our standards of living are and continue to be far above the rest. Just one stark example of this is that, and I made this point earlier on the Pat Kenny show, but I think it's an amazing fact that the European Union member states spend more on social supports than the rest of the world, including the United States, combined. So the European social model is one that, in my view, is worth preserving, but it's one that's under serious pressure. And we have to urgently realise that if we want to protect it, we desperately need one another. None of us can do it on our own. And I don't just mean the small countries. Even the big countries of the EU, like France and Germany, are basically small potatoes in today's global economy. They're dwarfed by China, Brazil and the rest. And they also have a rapidly ageing population, and they're challenged by countries that are far more productive and far more competitive than they are. And this is a common challenge, which EU countries must face together. Alone, we can't hope to compete with emerging economies. Together, we can really realign and reshape our European economy so that European citizens, including Irish citizens, can continue to enjoy a decent standard of living with, most importantly, prospects, opportunities and hope for future generations. And they're things that are currently in short supply. And this isn't just an aspiration of mine. I really believe that this is the absolute moral duty of my government and our counterparts in positions of authority right across the Union. So finally, that brings me to the question contained in the title of the session, which is fiscal union the only solution to the Eurozone crisis? And if I might say so, I think the title is actually a little bit limited. because the Eurozone crisis is really a symptom of a much greater problem and a greater challenge that we face. I agree about the obvious solution in terms of the short-term crisis that faces us, the role of the ECB and so on. I think I'm pretty much in sync with everybody on the panel in that regard. But the greater challenge is, how do we reshape the European Union and thereby our country to meet and measure up to the unstoppable force that is the emerging economies of the world? How do we create a European Union and a currency union that is robust, that can take decisions quickly, that is competitive, that sets standards for the rest of the world, and that caters to the economic and the social needs of its citizens? That is a burning question, and one which only in a small part can in fact be answered by the creation of a fiscal union. We need something really ambitious. We need a comprehensive solution. We need, in my view, a sort of a competitive federal Europe, which is, I think, what Alan in particular has alluded to. Often the word federal in Ireland is deemed to be a bad word. I completely disagree with that. I think federalism is a really pure and a transparent form of democracy. It means adhering to principles which are guided by a commitment to governing at the lowest possible level, the level closest to the people. It means decision-making at the most appropriate level, and it's based on a sort of a transparent social contract entered into willingly by individual states. I'm passionately in favour of that sort of transparent and accountable governance in the European Union. If the economic crisis has taught us anything, it's that the EU system we have is too slow and it's too difficult to cope with the fast-moving pace of our globalised world. We've repeatedly lamented that fact in Ireland. We complain constantly that there's no leadership and that Europe, in inverted commas, often that annoys me because it somehow sounds like we're not part of it or we're not responsible, that Europe has failed to act swiftly to deal with the crisis. I think it's a legitimate complaint in the sense that the European response to the crisis has been too slow, it has been too disjointed, but we have to face the fact that we haven't empowered Europe or our European leaders to take action in many respects. So if we want a European response, we have to change the system of decision-making, because we are the ones who can and who must enable the European Union to act. And only we, the citizens, and the sovereign states of the European Union can give the authorisation which is necessary for swift action. The word federation comes from the Latin word fidus, which means a pact or a contract. And it's an agreement by which states assume reciprocal and equal commitments to perform certain clearly enunciated tasks. I don't advocate a federation like that in the United States of America, just like Alan. I don't think it would work in a union of sovereign states as we have in Europe, nor is it desirable. What I favour is a federation of nation states, one which is built on the basis of the diversity and the richness of that diversity of its members. I see a new federal system as providing a vehicle for member states to assert their economic sovereignty in a global economy. They may even regain some of the sovereignty which they've lost, inevitably, to globalisation through greater coordination, greater cooperation and added economic strength and might. States would benefit from such a federation because they would in fact gain for themselves more rights, more liberty, more authority and more opportunity than they would be giving up. The time for muddling through is long past, and sadly this is not the first time that I have said this, but time is really running out. We need an ambitious redesign of the European Union and especially of the Eurozone if we are to secure its future for our citizens. What can a federalised system of governance in Europe achieve? Well, firstly, and probably most importantly of all, it can enhance the democratic legitimacy and transparency of the European Union. it can potentially bring Europe closer to its citizens. Crucially, it would enable the EU to address some of the shortcomings in the currency union and in the single market. Many of the changes which we need, and we know we need, are currently either impossible or they will take too long to achieve, and time isn't on our side. Most people accept, and it's been very well articulated by the other panellists, that the Euro project was flawed from the beginning. Not, in my opinion, and others will disagree, not because it was a bad idea, but because the economic and fiscal integration that was needed to make it work was simply absent. And we now need to inject urgency and impetus into this process. A federalised system would make it much easier to achieve progress in areas that are vital to the survival of our currency. It would reduce the potential for countries to veto important decisions and make it easier to progress vital big-ticket initiatives like a European bank resolution scheme or a Europe-wide bank deposit scheme and a mechanism for debt mutualisation such as Eurobonds, all of which are proposals that I consider to be vital to achieve the stabilisation of our currency and to secure its long-term future. Let me be frank, the entire conception of the single currency was predicated on the presumption that the governments would be prudent, that the good times would just roll on, and eventually everybody would join the club. The rules were weak and, as we've seen, pretty much unenforceable, but synergy, both political and economic, would sort that out at a later date. That was the assumption. I think the time has arrived to really finally put in place the architecture that is required to secure the currency. And key to the solution is a strong, democratically accountable political centre, an adequate central budget with access to its own resources, and I agree with you about some form of taxation. I previously, I think in 2009 here at the MacGill Summer School, floated the idea of some sort of a VAT levy to support a European budget. But we need the European Union to have access to its own resources in order to act as a shock absorber, and of course we need a true banking union. So all of these elements are necessary and much more achievable in a much quicker time frame if we change our system of governance. A federalised system would help to promote swift decision making in areas that are vital to the European Union as a whole, not just the Eurozone. So just let me give one example of this, which is the single market. The single market is simply the European Union's greatest achievement. Restrictions between European countries on trade and free competition were eliminated, with the result that standards of living across the board have increased. And the single market has been the greatest driver of growth in the EU, and it also, crucially, holds the key to future growth. However, progress on the single market in recent years has been frustratingly slow, and much of the momentum has been lost. On a simple issue, just as one example, the European unitary patent, it took the Council decades to arrive at a decision on its creation and on its location. And the saga isn't even over yet. And this is something that's vital, for example, to Ireland and to many other member states. It took decades of wrangling and posturing, bickering and protectionism on the part of certain member states, held up an initiative that was of vital interest to the economic development of the Union as a whole. That's just one example, and there are many, many more. We can't continue to limp along with 27 member states struggling to take decisions in an environment which forces them to value short-term national gain over medium and long-term Europe-wide gain. A form of constructive and competitive federalism can, on the other hand, give birth to a proper political and social Europe, whose institutions can ensure a balance between fiscal and monetary policies, an economic growth agenda, the structural reforms that are needed to enhance competitiveness and greater social cohesion. This is the sort of long-term strategy and vision that we need. The survival of the Eurozone requires robust economic governance and a workable European growth agenda. Federalism is the only way to avoid the disastrous consequences of the potential disintegration of the European Union and the Eurozone, and thus the disintegration of our standards of living. It will pave the way for a Europe of justice, solidarity and democracy, capable of holding its place proudly on the world stage. Now is a time when solidarity and unity at European level are more vital than ever. At times of crisis, there's always a risk that we retreat into ourselves or that we withdraw behind our national borders. I don't need to remind you the effects of that in the first part of the last century. This would be the very, very worst option for Ireland and for Europe. To survive this enormous political and economic storm, we must jointly forge a course with our European neighbours. Isolation is not an option. I'll conclude with what I think is an appropriate quote. That is, "So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth." I hope that can be our inspiration. Thank you very much.